Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken, in this new year?
Yes, very well, thank you. And I hope that the same is true of you, Rory. If you're listening in real time, this is the first episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast in 2021. It is episode 175. So happy new year if you are listening in real time. We're going to be covering three topics today, starting off with our student check-in, where we bring something from the world of studying. And we're going to be thinking about diversity today in real time. That's probably something you might be looking at in your studies at the moment. Moving on, we're going to be looking at the digital counselling revolution, where we're going to be delving into supervision while working online. Do we need a special online supervisor for working online? We're going to talk about that. And then we end episode 175 with practice matters, where we're going to be following on from episode 174, where we spoke about polyvagal theory. We actually have Emma Chapman as a guest, go delving deeper into the lecture that she did for us on polyvagal theory. So that is something to look forward to. But starting out with, I think, an evergreen topic, Rory. When we're speaking about equality and diversity, it may well be students this time of year might be studying it, might be looking at it a little bit closer, but I think it's something we need to look at closely no matter where we are in our counselling journey.
Yes, absolutely. And when we think about diversity, I guess on a very basic level, we are all different. We are meeting the other when we meet in the therapy room. We're meeting someone who has different experiences. But there are members of our community, and indeed ourselves, who are diverse. We are in a multicultural society, and as a consequence, we need to be thoughtful of how someone's view of the world and how their diversity has informed how they see the world. I think that my experience as a man in the world would be completely different to a woman's experience. And I remember recounting this story about having a door fitted in our home, and my wife having 3 attempts at trying to get the joiner out, and I phoned up and said, can you come out? And he came out immediately. And I wondered if that was because I was a man and I phoned up and said, can you come out and do it? And he really dismissed my wife. So I think we need to be very thoughtful as therapists about diversity, and also about, how people's history, the history of how people have experienced the world around them may impact on their mental health.
Very much so. And I think it's something that has become more and more in the light, I guess, Rory. I mean, if you go back 25 years, I think it would have been a very different landscape. And when we're talking about equality, we're talking about diversity, we're talking about, as you've mentioned, Rory, that all people are treated fairly. And specifically, if we're counselling, that we are treating everyone fairly. So understanding maybe any biases that we may hold, that's about self-exploration. But it's also treating them fairly on their ground. So where are they coming from? And it's if you did a Google search for diversity, you're gonna usually come up with what's known as the Big Seven, which is age, gender, race, religion, ability, whether that be physical or mental, sexuality, and socio-economic class. And they're all really important, but I think there's some missing on that list. If you delve a little bit deeper, we think about the LGBTQ diversity, ethnicity, neurodiversity, which is something we've spoken about on the podcast quite a lot. Family background. Is the person adopted? Are they from a non-conventional family background? Their heritage, culture, regional differences. I was watching, Rory, a YouTube channel in preparation for today's podcast, and the YouTube video was about 20 different dialects in the United Kingdom, starting in the south, working right up to Scotland in the north, and how different just the languages can be.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And this is what I alluded to about we are all the other. The idea that there is one individual kind of person and that makes society is a complete misnomer. We're all different, and we have to realize that when we meet someone, their view of the world may be completely different to ours. And you're absolutely right that the big 7 list that you alluded to is it's grown considerably. Transgender rights is a issue that is making the news, and it may be that as more people feel comfortable about being who they are in the body they think they should have, we're going to see more people coming to counselling. It was the same with gay rights. I can remember 20 years ago, when it became more acceptable to be gay, and I don't want to be really cruel about that, but when our society relaxed a lot more and was more accepting, more gay people came to therapy because they felt they could access it. So we're surrounded by diversity, and not to understand it and not to understand our own values. I think one of the key things here is that we are brought up with a view of the world. Our parents bring us up, we have a view of the world, and it might be that our view of the world isn't actually the view of the world. So we have to understand how our upbringing and our worldview may need adapting. It may not be correct. I mean, I'm 62, and I was brought up with a map of the British Empire on the wall, with all the countries, with the sun never sets on the British Empire, and thankfully we've moved into more enlightened times.
Yes.
But we really do have to realise that the biggest barrier, I think, in working with diversity is ourselves, because we need to be open to it. We need to understand our own processes.
100%. And I mentioned it earlier, those maybe we hold a hidden bias that is maybe not even seen to ourselves. And part of counselling journey, we say this so often, is about that self-development, self-searching, personal growth. And, when we're speaking about counselling, we're speaking about equality and diversity. If you look to your ethical framework, whatever ethical body you belong to, if you look to your ethical framework, chances are there's going to be something about equality and diversity in the framework. Here in the United Kingdom, we have a legislation, 2010 Equalities Act, which covers how people should be treated. And that's a law. That's a law that we cannot discriminate. And why is this when we're talking about counselling? Well, what we're looking for is we're looking for those potential barriers. Those barriers to communication, those barriers that a client may face, or that we as counsellors may put up within our counselling practice. So an example for that might be a lack of knowledge about a client's culture. A client may come in, they have a certain culture, we have a lack of knowledge about that, and we may ask something inappropriate or act in a way that is not fully accepting of that person's culture. Then we talk about accessibility. Not all buildings, not all counselling practices have a disability ramp. So they're not all equally accessible. We need to take that into consideration, because that as a barrier to communication or a barrier to therapy means that the person can't even enter service. They can't even get in to see the counsellor, to be there in service. And then communication. Maybe an interpreter is needed and is necessary. How might you work with that? Are you asking the questions that would uncover whether a interpreter is needed in a therapy session? So we're talking here about those potential barriers that we want to break down so that counselling can become accessible.
Yes, and I'd like to pick up on the language. I think even if both the client and the counsellor speak English, language is such a charged way of communication that we can sometimes really miss the clients. I can think of instances where clients have thought I was posh, which I think is quite strange. If I hear my voice, I hear a northern voice, but it's one of those things that when clients get a perception of who you are, if you can't pick that up, you can't work with it, and therefore that can be a barrier. And I can remember having to say, well, maybe that's just the way I speak. But let's talk about what posh is. Let's, and for those of you who may be listening internationally, posh is a word for upper class or higher class. It comes from the shipping when people used to cross the world on ships, port outward and starboard home. So you always got the sunny the sunny room, port outward and starboard home. But yeah, and I think it is really about meeting the other and being really tuned in to anything that could impact on the therapeutic relationship. And just to pick up what you said, Ken, that's why it's so essential we do CPD on this. It's so essential that we have an understanding of diverse groups and that we don't fall into the trap of asking our client to teach us. The clients come for therapy, not to give us a lesson in their diversity or just their way of living. They're not come to teach us.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. I like what you said about language. You can feel that you're speaking the same kind of language. But I'm just using an example now of maybe working with a younger person. I worked in colleges for some time, and it's about understanding how people of that age might communicate with one another. So if a younger client came in and said that something was really sick, I might think from my culture, my background, that, oh, shame, something might be wrong there. But sick is a common word right now as we're making this recording for something that's really good, amazing. And it can be misinterpreted. And if you think about that therapeutic connection where you're there with the person walking next to them, if you misinterpret a word, you may lose that connection and that empathic bond could be broken. So it comes down, as you said, Rory, to CPD. I know you worked at one stage with young people, adolescents, and you did CPD in social media, where they would hang out, the places that they would go, and you've shared that on previous podcasts. And that's what we're called upon. And that's what equality and diversity, I think, is about. It goes beyond just writing an assignment about it and kind of getting the questions right. It goes right into practice, and it does not stop. And in fact, we have paid for resources called the Counselling Study Resources for students of counselling and psychotherapy, where we have lectures and resources to help support you in your studies and get you through without the stress, maybe. And we've got a whole section devoted to equality and diversity because of the importance of this topic.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, Ken. And we really do have to focus on diversity. It's something that actually comes up so often in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, boy, oh boy, are you missing out. All you have to do is go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, click on that link. It's a closed group, and we'll let you in. And you'll be meeting thousands and thousands of like-minded people. They could be supervisors, they could be practitioners, they could be students. And this is a conversation that starts, that continues in the group. Diversity comes up. And in fact, I've just caught myself. I made a bit of a faux pas, Ken. I said, boy, oh boy, I was gender specific.
Yes. It's really interesting. I was speaking to a colleague of mine that is not in counselling at all. She works in education. She's putting some education resources together at the moment, and it's mathematical resources. And you would say a certain person lives so far away from the school, and how long would it take them to walk there if they walked at a certain? And the brief is to be non-gender specific in all the names that are used within the work, because that is the age and time we live in. Rory, it's interesting. You pick up your boy, oh boy. Man, oh man, Rory. Oh, whoops, there's another one. And so they go on. There's another letter in the back. So there it is. That's our student check-in, equality and diversity. If you're interested in our counselling study resources, if you're a student studying on a formal counselling course, you can get more information of that at counsellingtutor.com. So we move away from student check-in into the digital counselling revolution, where we recognise that technology now forms a part of how we engage in counselling, how our clients engage in counselling, and how counselling is delivered. And today we're going to be looking into supervision for online counselling.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Well, who would have thought last year, the beginning of 2020, that we would have had an epidemic of COVID. And I'm always a great believer in second order consequences. In other words, something happens and then there's a consequence of what's happened. And of course, a lot of people went to train online. They needed to continue with their clients. They needed that continuity. Their clients still needed assistance. So very sensibly, they took training courses to equip themselves to work online. The second order consequence of that is, of course, that they need supervisors who can supervise them online, because supervisors, Ken and myself both did supervision training, never covered the online world. It was face-to-face, never talked about the theories, the processes, the specific elements that need attention when you're working online. So it's always recommended that anybody who is working online has a supervisor that's also trained online and preferably has some form of supervision, online supervision qualification to be able to support practitioners, when working in in an online environment. And the thing is, the reality is that there isn't that many about, because up until COVID hit, people were working face to face. So if you are a therapist, you need to be very thoughtful about what kind of supervision you get, because your supervision should match the kind of practice you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, as you say, Rory, I mean, we built the online and telephone counselling course as COVID came up because we recognized that there was a need. We've had, I think it's over 9,000 therapists that have made their way through that course. And so often the question is, where can I find an online supervisor? And here in the UK, we have an organization called ACTO that kind of oversee online and telephone counselling. You can join them as a member. And when COVID first hit, they had a really small amount of people that were on their list registered as supervisor. Hopefully that has now increased. But there is a specialism, and we need to think about this. In that, you just need to go back a few of our episodes, and you're going to hear how different online counselling is to face-to-face counselling. And if you're working with your supervisor and you're bringing something from a client's presentation, and maybe there is a hidden disinhibition effect, if your supervisor is not able to pick that up, you're not able to pick that up, we're not acting in best service of the clients. But Rory, I guess a question that I might pose is, how do you work if you've trained up to work online and you go into supervision and you're not able to find a supervisor that is qualified online because they're all full up, you just can't get in, you've got your face-to-face supervisor that you've been working with for some time. What can we do? Because it's tricky. I don't expect you to come with the answer here, Rory. It's just that I think we need to have this discussion.
Well, I think you're right. I think, first of all, a lot of supervisors have done some form of online training. They may not have done a supervision specific training, but my sense is that a lot of supervisors, realizing that they're going to be supervising colleagues who are working online, have done an online training course. So I think that there is a huge amount of awareness out there. The ideal thing would be to do a supervision course specifically linking online theories with practice. That would be the ideal. But where we find ourselves, with the surge of therapists who are now working online and now looking and working with their supervisors, is I think that if you're not getting what you need from your supervisor, maybe find a supervisor who's done some training. You could also use a peer support group. If you've got a peer support group, other therapists that are working online, and I would say it's a developing discipline. This is not a mature kind of idea of working, mainly because the technology's changed. And I want to pick up on a specific point why it's really, really important to have a supervisor who's done online training, because the elements of risk when you're working online are higher than when you're working face-to-face. So if you think about it, you may have a client that is living on their own. They're not with anybody. What happens if they become ill in the session? What happens if they disassociate or break down? How are you going to support them in the therapy room? You've got access to colleagues. You can call an ambulance if someone is seriously ill. And it does happen. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. When you're working remotely, how does that work? Areas of risk in the therapy room, you can see all four walls. So it's a secure environment. When you're working in someone else's home, you can only see the wall behind them. So you've got to be tuned in to, is there anybody else in the room? Are there any dangers? What happens if the door opens? How do you react with that? You're working with a client, all of a sudden you hear the creak of a door. How do you work with that? That needs to be contracted. There are so many nuances in online work that a supervisor needs to understand. And I supervise, and I have to say that a majority of the observations that I make to my colleagues I supervise are now online. They're about online work.
Yeah.
So, and it's more and more, and they say, I never thought of that. How should we work with that? And we work that out together. So I do think that to be ethical, you really need to pay attention to supervision. And if your supervisor hasn't done a course, and there are lots of courses, we talk about ours, but there's lots of free courses. If your supervisor hasn't done a course, you may want to pose the question of why. You may want to ask. You're paying them for a service.
Bingo. That's it, isn't it? That's it. And it is a service, and you are paying to be there, and you do have the right to ask those questions. And as we are called upon to do CPD, so are our supervisors, And if you're bringing material to your supervisor where your supervisor maybe doesn't have those expertise, it's okay to suggest and say, maybe it might help our relationship if. And to make that suggestion, I think that's a good call there, Rory. As you were kind of speaking about the risk levels, one of the other things that came up for me is you would expect that on a supervision training course that a supervisor would learn about transference, counter-transference, and be looking out for that, because that's hidden to the counsellor who might be bringing material, and the supervisor would be looking out for that. And online, there are different forms of transference. For instance, if you're working on the telephone with somebody, so you don't have an actual picture of that person, there can be transference in just their voice. Who does that voice remind you of? What kind of picture comes up in your mind as the therapist when you're hearing this person's voice? Does it sound like a helpless person's voice? Does it sound like a strong person's voice? We're making those judgments, and this is something that a good supervisor who has training on online would be delving into, working with, and asking the question. So when this person, you haven't seen this person? No, I haven't. So you're hearing their voice. What kind of picture do you have in your mind of this person?
Yeah, the fantasy transference that can sometimes come with not seeing the clients. And I also think, and kind of reviewing my own supervisory practice, there's a lot of restorative areas. So there's formative, normative, and restorative in supervision. Formative is the kind of ethics and the good practice, and restorative is where you're supporting the therapist emotionally. Formative is education, and I think that the endings are completely different online than they are face to face. If you have a client who you've worked with, and then you arrange to meet with on the phone at a certain time, you give them a ring and they don't answer. I think that the impact on that on the therapist is can be greater than face to face, because you've not had any visual scene setting. I know there may be visually impaired therapists who don't have that ability to see clients, but generally speaking, you see a client, you get a sense if they're not going to come back. I've worked with a lot of clients, and they say, I'll see you next week, and you think, I doubt if they'll come back. You just get a sense when you've done this work for some time. And on the phone, just for someone to disappear, we have that what we call the black hole effect, where people just disappear, and it has a specific feeling attached to it. It's almost like it is a loss.
Yeah.
And supporting supervisees emotionally, as well as educating them and helping them stay within the ethical track, is a big part of supervision, which is why supervisors really need to know this stuff. They really do.
Yeah, and you're speaking about the restorative side of supervision. If I was working with a supervisee from face-to-face practice and they mentioned that they were maybe seeing a caseload of 7 clients within a day, that's quite a lot of clients to see within a day, but that may well be manageable for them. If somebody was working online and suggesting that they were seeing 7 clients in a day, I would really be delving into that, because of screen fatigue. By sitting in front of a screen is very different from sitting in front of another human being, and it creates a different level of fatigue. It's about, I'd be checking with them whether they have the right kind of breaks that they're putting in. So that's about the self-care of the counsellor. So there's a lot to consider there. I think good news, Rory, is that you have been working behind the scenes for some months now, building out a online and telephone supervision course. How's that been working out for you, Rory?
Well, it's been working out very well. There's a definite need for it, and we will be talking a lot of that as we move through. A lot more about this as we move through 2021. It will be accredited by a well-known awarding body, and it will be a thorough course which will allow a practitioner who wants to train as a supervisor to become a supervisor with an online element. So it will do the traditional face-to-face, but it will also do the essential online ingredients. And if someone is a supervisor and they fancy topping up, they may have done a certificate and now they want to do a diploma, well, of course, we're going to welcome you. And apart from refreshing those skills that you have, you'll be able to embed online specific supervision protocols and processes. So it's going very well. More news to follow, Ken. It is literally breaking news, isn't it?
Yes. I thought we'd just kind of let that out, seeing as though we're speaking about that very topic. That's going to be a level 6 qualification, and we don't have an exact launch date of that, but I've got a feeling around March 2021. You want to maybe be checking your inbox if you're on our mailing list. And if you're not on our mailing list, get yourself over to counsellingtutor.com. On our homepage there, you can actually join our mailing list to keep you up to date with what's happening in Counselling Tutor and the broader counselling world. Well, there you have it. There's our digital counselling revolution. We kind of back out of that, reverse out of that. We're now driving head first into practice matters, where we're going to be speaking with Emma Chapman on polyvagal theory.
In the last episode, 174, we talked about polyvagal theory, and I make no apology for bringing it into episode 175, because it is such a huge area of practice development that I think it's really, really useful to hear about it. And indeed, there's no better person to hear about it than the person who gave a lecture for us in our Counsellor CPD resource, a full hour's lecture on polyvagal theory. And I caught up with Emma Chapman, the lecturer who delivered it, and this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Emma Chapman, who's one of our regular presenters for our Counsellor CPD library and the Counselling Study Resource Student Library, a fab lecturer, and recently you've delivered a lecture on polyvagal theory. What's polyvagal theory, Emma?
Polyvagal theory is, you probably gathered from a lecture, one of my favourite theories. I love it so much. So the idea behind the polyvagal theory is that we can understand things like anxiety and things like depression in terms of our, how can I put it, our bodily defences, basically, our bodily defences being in play, and a lot of it comes from trauma. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Rory.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that has now become really apparent, I always think of our mental well-being like a jigsaw puzzle with little pieces being put in place as we understand more what informs our moods, how we feel, how safe we are in the world. And polyvagal theory is really the connection between mind and body, isn't it? How what's happening in our brains may very well then present as a real feeling, a pain or or a complaint within the body?
Yeah, what the polyvagal theory is based on is something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is a nerve that goes all the way through the body. It goes right the way from the brain. It's quite a big nerve. It's called the wandering nerve, and it goes all the way through the body, right down to kind of the legs and the muscles. And the idea is that this vagus nerve is the thing that is in charge of our survival and our autonomic nervous system. So it's quite a biological theory, this is, the autonomic nervous system. And it's constantly on the lookout for danger and safety. But it's kind of on the lookout for those things unconsciously. So our body's on the lookout for those things unconsciously all the time. And the idea is that when we sense danger or when we sense safety, we move up and down what we call the polyvagal ladder. We move into different states of being, and our body very much is, I suppose, in charge of that, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah,
it's almost like autopilot takes over.
Yeah.
And for those of you who may be familiar with, the Friends fight, flight, freeze and flop. So, I'm sure a lot of the people listening will have told their children off from time to time to see their children grinning at them. And you say, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing at me? And that's an automatic response to stress. And the reason people smile when they're being told off is because they're looking for an ally. They're kind of smiling and transmitting, we're sociable beings, and it moves through that. So, it moves into the fact that it's not just flight, fight or freeze or flop when we kind of completely disassociate. It moves into the fact that gets into our body. So in terms of the theory, would clients present with certain maybe aches and pains, and would that be linked to stress and trauma?
Yeah, I mean, this theory in particular really focuses on the body. So in the same way that somebody that's struggling with anxiety might come in and talk about having sore shoulders, because they're constantly holding their body in a very tense way. Anybody that is in that kind of stress response or a defensive response for an awfully long time, what happens to the body is they have an awful lot of cortisol and adrenaline running through the body. And the body's not really meant to hold that for an awfully long time. So what can happen is it starts to impact the body, and it can start to show itself somatically, or we mean through the body, in terms of aches and pains and illnesses, actually, in some cases. That's what the theory says.
Yeah, and we see that in bereavement, I think. I can remember speaking with a colleague, and he said, I'm working with a client at the moment who's got terrible headaches since they've been bereaved. And I said, the person who died didn't die of a brain-related injury. And she said, how did you know that? How did you know that? How did you know that it was that the person had a brain tumour? And it's not unusual for people who are bereaved to mimic some of the pains and ailments that the person who died had before they obviously died. And I think that links strongly to polyvagal system. It's a form of trauma response.
Yeah, and that's really what it's about, isn't it? It's that trauma response. The thing that, in particular with grief, I always think about in terms of the polyvagal theory is it very much looks at the fact that we're pack animals, like you said at the start. We're not meant to be on our own. We're pack animals. We need connection. It talks about connection with other people being a biological imperative, which is why there can be so many difficulties that come with loneliness, physical, mental difficulties that come with things like loneliness. And when we lose somebody, part of our grieving is the fact that we've lost part of our connection to other people.
Yes. It's when people say loss, it is a loss of connection, a loss of knowing, a loss of being known. in the world. So why is it important that practitioners understand at least the very basics of polyvagal theory, Emma?
I think it's important because I think, as I said in the lecture the other day, we're really good as therapists, aren't we, at challenging stories that our clients tell themselves, the narratives that they often kind of live within that often aren't true. And we're also really good at, being another safe human connection for them, which is really important for the polyvagal theory. But one of the things that we don't often do is think about the body and the body's part in all of that. And I think that what we know about some of these different states that the body ends up in is, for example, when you're in fight-flight state, that's one of the 3 autonomic states that the polyvagal theory talks about, this fight-flight state. You can't access rational thought. It's very difficult to access that rational thought. So if we're sat there with a client expecting them to challenge the stories they're telling themselves when they can't access rational thought, what we need to do sometimes is move to working with the body or at least helping a client to feel safe enough so that they're not in fight flight in the room. So that's why it's useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something it's an emerging idea. It's been around for a few years, but it's finding a lot of traction in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And is there a role for psychological education here? If a client is saying, since this has happened, I'm finding pains and as well as feeling down. Is there a role for the therapist to help them understand the process, the autonomous, I can't say it,
autonomic nervous system.
I knock all the vowels off anyway because it's from Manchester. Autonomic nervous system. Is there any value in them giving them some psychological education?
I think it's really powerful, actually, if we can work with a client and give them some psychoeducation around what's happening in their bodies and their brains, around these different states. So, for example, fight, flight. We often will hear somebody sat in front of us saying, I'm a clever person. Why can't I think my way out of this problem? Why do I end up catastrophizing? If we can say that's really normal because you're in this state, your whole body thinks you're in danger, you're in this particular state, it's really difficult to access rational thought. All of a sudden, they stop feeling so ashamed and stop judging themselves so harshly and actually think, okay, this is what my body's supposed to do. So how can I calm myself down without trying to think my way out of it? I suppose that's the way that I would think psychoeducation can be really, really important.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I will speak to my clients about, ever lost your car keys? You're rushing out, you're very late, you've lost your car keys, you can't find them, you get very stressed, and eventually you give up and you sit down, and all of a sudden there they are on the table, and you think, why didn't I see those before? And I say, well, that is because that part of your brain switched off. It was more interested in surviving or, living with the panic state. So I'm with you, Emma. I think psychological education is really important. And of course, you do in-depth training on the polyvagal system as well, don't you?
Yeah, I do a day of training actually, where we look at how you might integrate it into the work that we do. I'm not a somatic therapist. I don't work specifically with the body, so it is very much about looking at how we can use this in our day-to-day practice. If you're a person-centered therapist or a cognitive behavioural therapist, how you might be able to integrate this, because I think it's important.
So I think the message there is, no matter what modality you practice, a polyvagal theory is an essential piece of the jigsaw puzzle to help your clients, and also to provide some form of psychological education to help the clients support themselves. So, Emma Chapman, it's always a pleasure having a chat with you, talking with you. So thank you very much.
Big thank you to Emma Chapman and to you, Rory, for organising that chat so that we could learn more about polyvagal theory. And if you are interested in Emma Chapman's lecture on polyvagal theory, you can get more information by going to counsellingtutor.com. That lecture is part of our CPD library, our continuing professional development library that is put together for qualified practitioners. Why? So that you can sharpen your competence. That's what it's there for. All that information, counsellingtutor.com.
Absolutely. And what an interesting mix of topics in our episode today. We started off by working with our students, student population, thinking about diversity. And in fact, even a qualified practitioner needs to have diversity right in the centre of their mind and front of their mind when they're working with clients. We moved on and in the digital counselling revolution to talk about getting the correct supervision, making sure that when you're working in the service of your clients, you're getting the correct supervision, certainly around the elements now of online working. And finally, we caught up with the fab Emma Chapman, who outlined her fabulous lecture on polyvagal theory. So as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the digital counselling revolution.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.